All right, these are some books I use for a Psalms class I've been teaching over the last decade. Yep, Susan Gillingham, Robert Alter's translation, Greenberg, Brueggemann's take. Wenham, I assigned that one. Brueggemann again, great articles. Some good articles in here too. Josh, I see you. What a well written book. This is a diss, but her commentary is better. I've taken over his class. It's a good dissertation. Josh, there you are again. Again, well written book. All right. I use that all the time. And yep, gems in there. This is by Pat Miller, the notes are. And Adele Berlin does the notes in there. And then the New Interpreters is by McCain, which is just great. Other commentaries, certainly Brueggemann's, Golden Gaze. That's all I got.
All right, we're on a journey from structure to function to theology, all the way to ethics, where it actually hits the ground. 30,000, 20,000, 10,000, and the rain comes. 0. And so we're working through the Psalter with this sort of pragmatic framework. And I want to finish some thoughts on structure and move through the function stuff and hitch into theology. So it'll take the form of just 5-10 minute sections, mirroring the structure of the Psalter. So what is going on with this intertextual web that is the Psalter? We know that it has 5 books, one editorial marker at 72. This is the end of the prayers of David, the son of Jesse. And so maybe 73 is the middle point, which is convenient, because if you do say 73 is the middle, as Brueggemann does, and others have sort of said, yeah, that makes sense. There's 17 Psalms in that middle book, which might lead you to think, is there a center in the middle book? But, save that for later. There might be a theological center. There might be a structural center. There might be a functional center. But if you do take 73 to be the center, you have 73 to be the center. You have 72 going that way, and then 72 going to 45, which really signals an end. It is an acrostic, an aleph bet poem, and then you have a 5-part or a 5-psalm hallelujah chorus that really ends the Psalter. And those acrostics, they seem to kind of be strategically placed. Sometimes they function as seams, but it's not an accident, it seems, that 45 is where it is. It looks out towards the end, the words of my mouth, and then every living thing, praise the Lord. It has this thematic connection. It seems aware of those last 5, but it's an acrostic. And so acrostic is one of those things that we want to finish up with as we think about structure. But notice some deep consequences for acrostic as we think about it in relation to the whole Tanakh, the whole Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh. So the whole Hebrew Bible, depending on how you count, and if we're thinking with David Noel Friedman, you certainly count the 12 minor prophets as one book. In the writings, in Ketuvim, you count that middle section, Miglot, the 5 scrolls, as one book. And so it leaves you with a 23-book structure to the whole of the Hebrew Bible. Now remember, an acrostic is 22, because that's how long the Hebrew alphabet is. But notice in key psalms, and we'll look at some of these in detail. Notice in key psalms like 25, 34, sometimes they're missing a letter, which is fine. This might be chalked up to transmission history, missing a line here and there. That's okay. It's okay. When a psalm was missing a line, some people think there was a convention to add a pay at the end of the psalm, kind of an extra line to fill out the acrostic, because you don't want an acrostic without 22 letters. But that doesn't fully explain it, because some acrostics have all 22 letters accounted for, and then there is a pay at the end, a pay line. If If you notice the end of the Psalter, 150, it's debated, at least in my mind, whether it's a pay line. The word mouth is there, which starts with a pay. And, depending on how it's rendered, maybe it's the first line, maybe the ta is the first line, but that's later. So maybe the last line of the Hebrew Psalter is a pay line, an extra line, which would make, in some senses, those last 5 Hallelujah Chorus Psalms kind of a pay line. At the end of 145, which is an acrostic. Well, that's kind of interesting to think about. But what's a little bit more interesting is how it is that pay functions and structures or keys the reader into a kind of structure at the individual psalm level. So the pay shows up, and it is understood that certainly parallelism is going on. Certainly chiasmus or chiasm is happening in the Psalter, functional centers or panels that mirror each other. Certainly that's happening. And so when an acrostic shows up and there's a 23rd line, some scholars think of the pay as helping the reader see certainly the middle, so it refers back to the middle and back to the beginning, okay? Middle and beginning. So in our case, with an individual psalm, it would refer back to the middle, which would be El or Lamed, and then Aleph. And so if you take Al, the P, the pay line refers back to the beginning, Aleph, Lamed, pay, which spells the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, okay? Aleph. And so this is interesting, especially because in the Hebrew Bible as a whole, if a kind of functional structure has been imposed on these books, depending on how you count them, can be really interesting. Does the chronicler represent a kind of pay line, pay for the whole Hebrew Bible? Now, when you think of it that way, certainly Chronicles starts with Adam and gives this 9-chapter genealogy, but also Ezra, its beginning, and Chronicles end are exactly the same. So there's this unit that the chroniclers structured those 3 books around. Again, how you count them can lead you to 23, it can lead you to 24, but we're counting like it's intentionally 23. But notice then, if Chronicles is the end of the Hebrew Bible, how it rehearses from Adam, from the humans, the whole trajectory, all the way through, right, to the fall, and Cyrus being the anointed one, and you have the whole thing right there recounted, kind of like in the psalm structure, the pay line, certainly in many of them, function just like that. Other poems in the Hebrew Bible outside of the Psalter, have a pay line as well. Very interesting. So we're talking structure, but we're also, we're weaseling our way into how a psalm might function, or how that function might even, at a different scale of analysis, might be how the whole Hebrew Bible functions. So when you bring that information in, it's helpful. We've also noticed, of course, how it is those first 5 books, and then the importance of 5 in the Hebrew Psalter, being the book structure, being that last Hallelujah chorus, and the writings as a whole, that Miglot. And so you have a kind of looking back as early as, some Midrashim that are in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. The claim is made that yes, the 5 books of Torah were given to us by Moses. We're not talking about real authorship. Of course, Moses didn't recount his death, but you have the 5 books of David. And David's character is an extended, flexible character. Again, in Psalm 2, we hear about this Berit Olam that was given over David for 2 Samuel 7, but David's not mentioned in Psalm 2. It's an expansion of this Davidic character. And so David as a dominant character in the first half of the Psalter fades. Certainly there is that kind of halving of the whole Hebrew Psalter in 72, the only editorial note technically that really tells us that we're moving on from the Davidic line. Solomon gets his one psalm in 72. Solomon's line, we know how that ended, right? Right after, this is 1 Kings chapter 11, chapter 12, you have a fall. The people descend into two kingdoms, but it looks exactly like the fall. I mean, it's verbatim, right? There's golden calves, all this stuff. Verbatim, the situation with Aaron in Exodus 32, 33, and 34, and the covenant renewal that we see there in the middle of Exodus, maybe the middle of Torah, according to Milgram. And so the second half gets really interesting because you do have a kingdom theme, you have a Torah theme. Torah is sort of elevated at Psalm 19. At Psalm 119, Torah is elevated in a bigger way, so there's an extension of that theme. These psalms are buttressed thematically. You also have the kingdom emphasis, and then Yahweh, Melech, Yahweh is king. In the Psalms, following 90, which reintroduces Moses, and we're into the last half, the last book, and so there is these kind of structural weights that also have theological import, as well as they're developing a kind of interpretation of the Psalter that is reliant on previous texts. It's not always quotation. It's often texts that are from memory, a recollection of previous texts. We'll look at that in the theology section. And when we get farther on in this function section, recollection or remembering something orally, especially in song, and transmitting it is different than, say, a quotation from, a particular, the Masoretic text, or say the LXX or something like that. And so, structure, we'll say it's behind us, but we'll keep looking back at it as an instrument of interpretive help. All right, we are moving into function. We've finished structure. Thank you, David Michael Howard Jr. We will refer to his dissertation as we're talking about function. His outline of key psalms, 93 through 100, and his work in counting syllables. Look at this. What he finds is there is essentially an average, which kind of makes it a unit, and the stresses are also quite uniform, making this part of the Psalter certainly a unit. It has Moses themes buttressing it as well, but we'll get to that eventually. What I want to do is focus on some general ways in which the Psalter functions. We will save the liturgical elements of the Psalter's function for our time doing theology. We will save some of what we could say about imitatio Dei, or imitating God. We'll save some of that for the theology section, but it's still very much part of the functionality of particular psalms. And Wenham sort of highlights that. If you're already into that, the function of memorization, and then narrative, and eventually mimetic ethics. So for this function section, we'll take note of those. But what I want to do is start sort of at ground zero and build upwards. Posted on Classroom is Adele Berlin's article from the dynamics of biblical parallelism, her introductory article. And before that book was published, she had published a paper, and so the article you have sort of encapsulates some of that original article, but the book itself fleshes out the article. And the article is grammatical aspects of biblical parallelism. And her focus here is mostly not in rehearsing what parallelism is, summarizing Loth and Kugel, who sort of questions if it's a helpful category, or poetry is a helpful category for Hebrew parallelism, because parallelism happens in narrative and poetry. But what she does is she goes through grammatical aspects. So what she means particularly, and some of this you can't quite see in the English, which is fine, but it can be summarized this way: grammatical aspects of biblical parallelism, she says, is morphological. And when she says that, she's thinking of word pairings. And so you might say in a psalm have Israel, Jacob, and those are word pairings on different lines. And so morphology is interested in how these word pairings morph. Sometimes the word is cleverly mixed. Hebrew has, most every word has 3 consonants, and so those consonants might flip around and create a different word, which is a creative and dynamic process. And you might miss that in the English, and that's okay. English translators might try to communicate that, especially Alter's translation. He'll try to maintain some of those readings. But there's morphology, which is word level, so that's ground zero, if you will. And out from there, there's syntactical. We're paying attention to the line as a whole. And so a line, let me read, this is an example of symmetric parallelism, Psalm 114. If you want to turn there, that'd be great. You'll be able to see it. Psalm 114, which brings up Egypt. This is part of the Egyptian Hallel, praise psalms. When Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. And so you have 4 lines there, both A, B, and extensions in some ways of the previous line. So what I mean by extension, even though these are very symmetric, the whole line kind of parallels what comes before. We'll think of it as syntactical. Notice the extension. When Israel went out from Egypt, Mitzrayim, the house of Jacob, notice how it's extending the concept of Israel, reaching back to Jacob's former name, but also eliciting the idea of house or householder. Jacob is the householder. From a people of strange language, being Mitzrayim, Egypt. Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. So in verse 1 and 2, you could even see an inclusio with the concept of Israel buttressing house of Jacob, Judah. But the second line, the B line, extends in some way. This can take some interpretation. Extends in some way the previous statement. So when you're looking at not just word pairings, Israel, Jacob, but lines as a whole, one of the things you notice, Berlin says, Loth from 1778, I think, was when Loth's article, an Anglican minister, published his work, is that second line in some way extends the former. Okay, so this is a function of Hebrew poetry. It doesn't rhyme. There's a long debate about meter. We won't get into that. You can count syllables and see patterns as many have done. This method is sort of pioneered by David Noel Freeman, David Howard's mentor, and also we've taken from his work to think about the structure of the whole Hebrew Bible. But counting syllables or counting words is really fruitful, especially when you're thinking about large sections and how you see them as wholes. And that's part of what Howard is doing. And that's certainly what Friedman did in his commentary on Hosea and his work on the 119th Psalm. So, grammatical parallelism, if it's morphological, we're focused on the words. This can be really interesting, especially in the original languages, when you notice, say, a root being played with or a rhyming pattern. Not all Hebrew poetry rhymes, but there might be a rhyming pattern that's just below the English. But then also lines themselves, different words might correspond in a chiastic pattern, placing center emphasis even between lines. You see that actually in the Lord's Prayer, probably, which has 3 lines and then 3 lines, and it looks chiastic around in heaven, so on earth, is how the Greek runs. But the things in heaven could parallel to the things below. And so you have whole lines that could connect to one another. There's a great book on that called The Greatest Prayer by Dominic Crossan. If you're interested in morphology, and you want to do the deep dive on that, Zion Zevet is the person I'll point you to. But Berlin summarizes her pioneering article this way. The section of morphological parallelism has demonstrated that there is more to paralleling terms than the selection of semantically appropriate word pairs. Semantically appropriate, meaning appropriate. Semantics is the study of meaning. Shem means name. Semantically appropriate word pairings. The Hebrew is going to be more creative than that in its word pairings. It's not just definition for definition, they're expansions. It is not only important to see which terms are used, but how they were used. The form of the word pairs is as interesting as its content. And you can hear her emphasis there on the grammatical structure. This word goes with this word, and if that is the case, then look at what the Hebrew poet is doing. The structure of the language permits the paralleling of one term by another from the same morphological class or from a different class. So there's flexibility in word pairing. It's almost like they're painting with a new image. I like to think of this as the difference between Bob Dylan, who's painting with words. You go from one category to another, versus Johnny Cash, who kind of his musical intonation is he says what it is, and he's storytelling, and there's logical leaps. Hebrew poetry isn't limited by that. It sounds a little bit more like Dylan. There's a great book, I can see it from here, Tangled Up in the Bible, that looks at Bob Dylan's poetry in relation to biblical poetry. But she goes on, syntactic or syntactical parallelism and morphological parallelism together consist of grammatical parallelism. Grammatical parallelism is a device whereby the grammar of language is activated in order to create parallel stitches. There's kind of a trickle-down effect, you might say. The parallelism is achieved by structural substitutions or pairings in addition to lexical semantic pairings. All right, so it makes it fun to read. and it makes it surprising to read. And it makes us really contemplate how it is that first psalm instructs us to read the thing. If this is a new Torah, the Psalter in 5 books, emphasized at the end with 5, and we have all of these Torah psalms that are climactic middles in the 2 sections of the Torah that buttress the middle 3. So I'm thinking of 19 and 119 being big, huge Torah psalms. And then kingship in the middle, and then there's that middle section. If we're thinking about how it is we'll read this story, this book, this mobile tabernacle that we enter by the pilgrimage of reading, as Bill Propp says in his Exodus commentary, that's how we enter the tabernacle, by reading about it in Exodus. He says a similar thing of the Psalms, and we could say that a similar thing of Leviticus. But if we're meditating on it, if we're catching the nuance, these are not poems that function as speed reads, right? And so I apologize now for making you read it all at once, but the purpose of that was not to meditate on it. That's something you can do later. The purpose of that was for you to catch the whole flow of the story. And so parallelism in this case, and we're thinking particularly of the grammatic aspects, A-B pattern, often 3 words in the Hebrew, 3 words, 2 words, often in a lament structure. And as you read it, it has a kind of limp to it. What we're saying is the function at the grammatical level is instructive. It slows the reader down. It makes it wisdom literature. It has almost a proverbial character, not Proverbs 1-9, but the stuff afterwards. But that even in Proverbs, instruction, Torah is emphasized in the first 9 chapters. This is a kind of Torah that you're supposed to meditate on, read slowly, chew on, eat the book like Ezekiel was instructed to do, savor it, relate it to positive things like honey. And so that meditation, the word there in the beginning of the Psalter, to meditate, is Haggah. And Haggah is used all throughout the Psalter and in Deuteronomy, which we'll look at that in our theological section. When Moses goes to finish up the law in 32, he then sings Haggah's a psalm. And it sounds oh so psalmic. And so meditate could mean, and we're thinking again about function, how these do function. Meditate could mean, and is translated often in multiple translations, it could mean sing. One article I'll bring attention to on that is, here he is, Torah Meditation and the Psalms, the invitation of Psalm 1. This is an article by Michael, I'm going to mess up his last name, but Le Fur. And he makes this connection to the Deuteronomic tradition. The life of prayer is thus bounded up by obedience, Psalm 1, and praise, Psalm 150, says Brueggemann. And in meditate, Haggah, also seen in Proverbs 8. So in that first part of Proverbs, you're instructed to do a similar thing, 8:7. It could be reciting, it could be reading. Articulate groans is one way to translate it. Deep emotional thoughts. This is how it's been translated in the tradition of translation. And, singing. And that's not the main translation, but if it's starting the Psalter, I'm certainly the semantic range of that word, Haggah, could lend itself to sung speech. And so one of the functions we could look at is what is the difference between singing the thing and simply meditating, reciting, maybe saying out loud, chewing on is one other translation. What does it mean to sing them out loud? I'll consider this a tangent over here, but we could think a little bit about our modern context. How is it we came to be creatures that read books quietly to ourselves? And that's a 1700s creation. People, it seems, would read out loud to themselves in the evening under candlelight. And people didn't so much, recite thoughts in their head. They would say things out loud. It's kind of a lag from the oral culture, right? But what does it mean to be singers of psalms, sayers of psalms? Is there a difference in reading it out loud versus reciting it quietly under your breath to yourself? I had an experience of reading the book of Isaiah, the second Isaiah, so 40 through 66 in Isaiah class I was in with a roommate in seminary. And Drew and I, sat across from each other, lying down on the floor, and just read Isaiah out loud back and forth. And by the time you get to the end of Isaiah and someone's reading it to you and you're reading it back, it's a very intense experience, especially if you've sat with the book under, again, John Goldengay was teaching that class. He's a Psalm scholar and Isaiah scholar. It was very intense. Both he and I were weeping. So what effect or function does the singing of Psalms have on you? Certainly, it's much easier to memorize the things. Vocalizing something is one of the ways in which you memorize or internalize great literature. Wenham, sun's coming and going here. Wenham has a great insight here as you're finishing that reading. This is chapter 3, Psalter as an anthology to be memorized. He says, and as a reader memorizes a text, he becomes textualized. This is some verbiage from William Schwiedevin, how the Bible became a book. These are textualized persons. That is, he embodies the work that he is committed to memorize. Ezekiel's eating of the prophetic scroll is a representation of the kind of incorporation and internalization involved in religious reading. The work is ingested, used for nourishment, incorporated. It becomes the basis of rumination and for action. A memorized work, like a lover, a friend, a spouse, a child, has entered into the fabric of the possessor's intellectual and emotional life in a way that makes deep claims upon that life. Claims that can only be ignored with effort and deliberation. All right, so he's pulling that from Griffin's religious reading, which is, he's using that in David Carr to make an argument for the Psalms being a memorized text, which gives rise to the function or a series of functions. If it's memorized, then it is recollected text. It is, when we think of intertextual theory, it is recollected story. And so quotation looks different. How it is the story of Israel is rehearsed is different than, say, quoting a singular text out of the Torah that matches perfectly to the MT, the Masoretic text, or the LXX, or whatever it may be. You can think of the ancient rabbis, including Jesus. They were thought of in the village as people of the book, certainly, but they were the library. A rabbi's function was not just to teach, it was to recite the text for people. Most communities would not have a full scroll of Torah. They might have, the Isaiah scroll. These were not easy to come by. And so a rabbi who had studied under another rabbi would have committed the Torah to memory, would have committed the prophets to memory, would have committed eventually the writings to memory, the last collection to come together. But you can see the oral tradition has its fingerprints on really the textual shape of the Psalter. So rabbis, were living books, as they're called. Didn't need to cite verse numbers because they weren't there, but they had internalized the structure and of course, could picture in their mind's eye, spatially, and then through story, which are the two main modes of memorization. I'm quoting a book, Moonwalking with Einstein, the art and science of remembering everything. Joshua Foer wrote that book, and that's his big takeaway from studying mnemonists who memorize random stuff in competitions. Spatial and storied memory are how our hippocampus and amygdala, function, and long-term memory and then working memory together, spatial and storied texts, which the Psalms are, right? Or at least we've named them as such. We've observed that as a function. So the text functioning as a memorized, internalized, sung text has an effect on the individual, on the self. We will look more at that as a theological component. What I do want to do to conclude this section, will be close to 25 minutes here, is highlight one article that is posted near the bottom. This is from Brent Strawn, who's now at Duke, formerly at Emory. Really nice guy. He translated the Psalms in the Common English Bible, and so an article that he wrote introducing an introduction of Brueggemann's. This article is the Psalms and the Practice of Disclosure. Of course, we're going to get to lament in our theological section, but the nature of disclosure itself, telling someone your secret, your sin. Catholics got this nailed. They still have confession. Protestants, Anabaptists, low church situations might have it on that end. But yeah, the high church still has this as a sacramental duty, right? But disclosure, he uses Post-Secret, these collections of mail-in postcards that are individual secrets. They mail them in, and Warren, the author, publishes them. It's been 20 years of this, and they're incredible. If you've ever picked up one of these volumes, they're intense. And this article does mention self-harm, suicide, but he likens some of these texts to what you see in the Psalter. Particularly, he uses 32, Psalm 32 as an example. He doesn't quote the beginning, which has 3 ways of doing sin and 3 ways of expunging sin, which would be a great way to look at parallelism. So you can do that on your own. 32, verse 1 and 2 and maybe 3. But he picks up at verse 4. He says, and of course it's CEB translation, "When I kept quiet, my bones wore out. I was groaning all day long, every day, every night, because your hand was heavy upon me. My energy was sapped as if in a summer drought. So I admitted my sin to you. I did not conceal my guilt, I confessed my sin to the Lord, is what I said. Then you removed the guilt from my sin," which is an interesting phrase. "That's why all the faithful should pray to you during troubled times, so that a great flood of water won't reach them. You are my secret hideout. You protect me from trouble. You surround me with songs of rescue." Is the psalmist referring to the psalm itself, within itself? How am I not myself? Kind of a meta moment. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna pause there, and what we'll do in this last shorter section is look at a few more functions and how the text sort of exemplifies certain functions of parallelism. We'll look more at semantic or meaning-based parallelism, and then the function of certain genres. And our article with Brueggemann is a typological, functional view of genre, and that is recommended. It's one of the top 4 that's on the list. And so we'll look at how that works. Certainly it works with theories like Paul Ricoeur, who wrote Time and Narrative in a 3-volume, and how texts imitate life, and what it means to be a storied person. So we'll do that, and that's where we'll catch that lament loop when we go through orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. All right, this one might get a little weird, but we want to conclude our conversation about function generally. When we do theology and we do ethics, ethos, story, narrative, what we do with our lives, and how people have done certain things with the Psalms, reception, we will come back to function, but in different terms. So how do the Psalms continue to function? One analogy that is put forward in the study of law, I'm thinking of Donald Dworkin. Okay, here he is with his big book, A Matter of Principle. Stan Fish, a theorist. This is a great book, Doing What Comes Naturally, Change, Rhetoric, and the practice of theory in literary and legal studies. The Psalms kind of fit into that matrix. One of the proposals that Dworkin makes about law is that it's a kind of story. And here's the analogy. I think it's useful when we think of how Psalms function together, or how one psalm next to another psalm next to another psalm function. He says, imagine the scenario. Apparently this is a thing that novelists used to do, where one novelist would begin this novel, chapter 1, and how you start a novel really matters. Is it in the beginning? It's a really strong start, as we know. Or a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That's a strong start, but now you're referring to the past. Once upon a time. How you start the story really matters, he says. Okay, but chapter 1 goes off, and the practice is you mail it to another novelist, and that next novelist writes their short story. But that second novelist in the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th and the 6th and the 7th and the 8th and the 9th and the 10th, and in our case, the 150th, in some sense, has to conform their telling, their chapter, to what has come before, if it's to be a functional narrative. And so you can take the view that the novelist might not read the previous chapter or the first chapter, or they might kind of jumble it up or read it poorly and then proceed, or they might introduce something new to the trajectory of the story. But these stories are created, right, through time. They're passed along and they're generative, but they require someone reading backwards, right? They require that last edition to intentionally put accent on what has come before. All right, and now this sounds a little bit like intertextual theory, but really it's a theory of the novel or the theory of law. And so for Dworkin, he says, this is kind of how common laws develop. You might have a constitutional text like we do in the United States, the Constitution. You might not. You might just have a series of laws that work together, call it English common law. Now, the metaphor is transferable in some ways. You could think of the way we've described the Psalter as an anthology of poetry, but the structure, the function of anthologies is that they're a collection bound together. They sort of interpret one another. They might be from the same class of text or the same era, etc. But the whole is important to how the particulars function, right? A default interpretive theory in sociology that the whole of society and the individual are interconnected. How, adult males behave, has a picture of masculinity as a whole. How females behave is a picture of femininity in this culture. And so if you think of the text as a string of pearls or a developing story with different sequences, each individual psalm has some more elasticity, you might say. And again, this does creep into theories of intertextuality. We'll mention those now. But I want you to be aware of that helpful illustration. The article is Law as Literature. And many a sociologist or anthropologist like Mary Douglas, her book Leviticus as Literature, have used that kind of motif to understand how collections come together and how they're best interpreted as a progressive, unending sometimes story shot through with meaning. So, excuse me. So what I think is helpful is to just look at a particular instance where we have a literary scene within the Psalter, and then we'll weasel our way into intertextual questions. And so a couple things going on at the beginning and then the end. So the beginning of book 4 and the end of book 3. You have this couplet in book 3 of 88 and 89. We've looked at 89 a little bit, and you have this, it's almost like 89 looks back at 88 and picks up this idea of, how long, O Lord? O Lord, I cry out to you, 88:13. O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? Wretched and close to death, from my youth up. I suffer your terrors. I am desperate. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dread assaults destroy me. Strong language. And as it ends, they surround me like a flood all day long. From all sides they close in on me. You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me. My companions are in darkness. End scene. Psalm 89. Okay, let's fix this. I will sing of your steadfast love, O Lord, forever. With my mouth, I will proclaim your faithfulness to all generations. Okay, unlike Psalm 88 here. I declare that your steadfast love is established forever. Your faithfulness is as firm as the heavens. You said, you have made a covenant with my chosen one. You have sworn to my servant David, I will establish your descendants forever and build your throne for all generations. This might be calling back to Psalm 2. You have said that. The psalmist has read that, bringing it forward. Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? A God feared in the council of the holy ones, great and awesome, above all that are around him. O Lord of hosts, who is as mighty as you? You almost seem like the psalmist is buttering God up. So by the time we get to 19, there's a pivot. Then you spoke a vision to your faithful one and said, I have set the crown on one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found my servant David with my holy oil, anointed him. The word melech, Mashiach, Messiah is the root of that word, anointed. My hand shall always remain with him. My arm also shall strengthen him. The enemy shall not outwit him. The wicked shall not humble him. My faithful and steadfast love shall be with him, and in my name his horn shall be exalted. Hear God's voice kind of breaking in. He shall cry to me, you are my Father. Again, 2 Samuel 7. My God and the rock of my salvation, I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. Forever I will keep my steadfast love for him, and my covenant with him will stand firm. Now, this goes on for a while. We get to 38. But now you have spurned and rejected him. You are full of wrath against your anointed, your Messiah. You've rejected him. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. You have broken all his walls. You have laid his strongholds in ruins. All who pass by plunder him. Okay, you can hear picking up themes from the previous psalm, picking up themes from Psalm 2 and then 46. How long, O Lord? Will you hide your face forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire? Remember how short my time is. For what vanity you have created all mortals. The word there is Havel, which we've discussed, Abel's name, the name of Babylon in the Hebrew Bible. Meaninglessness, vanity. Who can live and ever see death? Who can escape the power of Sheol? Lord, where is your steadfast love of old? Earlier in the psalm, we were experiencing it seemed, which by your faithfulness you swore to David, referring back to almost the same line, 88:11, almost verbatim. Remember, O Lord, how your servant is taunted, how I bear in my bosom the insults of the peoples with which your enemies taunt, O Lord. There's an echo here, and I want you to hear it. Your enemies. It's almost like Moses on Sinai, your people who you brought out of Egypt. And God says to Moses previously, no, it's your people that you brought out of Egypt. This point at which Moses convinces God to go into the land with the people in Exodus. There's some echo of that, with which they taunted the footsteps of your anointed. And then it ends, it seems like it ends at 52 with this seam. Blessed be the Lord forever and ever. Amen and amen. Which is the same as how 41 ends and how 72 ends. But then we have 90, and I'm just looking at how these things kind of hook together in a way that it's almost like they read the previous text. And so in this new book, this new collection that comes alongside, this new short story, you might say, 90 to 106, it's a prayer of Moses, which is unique, just like 72 was a prayer of Solomon, and that's unique. Oh, coming back. And notice this, in Psalm 90, the Moses Psalm, let's move down and listen for another callback and echo, a developing theme that the psalmist might be picking up, stitching together, letting the reader understand. Who considers the power of your anger? This is verse 11. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is due to you. So teach us to count our days, that we may gain a wise heart. Sounds Mosaic. Verse 13. Turn, O Lord. How long? Have compassion on your servants. See that reaching back again? How long? But this idea of God turning, the word is shuv, repent, change your mind. This is the only time in the Psalter where this phrase is used of God. I'm basing that off of DeClancy Walther's book, Reading from the Beginning. She does parts of the Nikot. She's the lead contributor to the Nikot Psalms, which is a really good commentary. I'll talk about that 2 sessions from now. She points that out, and I looked. I can't find it anywhere else in the Psalter. You get hints of it because the lament structure wants God to do something, but she says, and I trust her on this, she's a good Hebraist, turn, shuv, is the only time this happens in the Psalter. But it is the climactic moment in the Exodus story, maybe, the climactic thematic structure of Torah 32, 33, 34, on top the mountain. There's a great book on that called At the Mountain by Moberly. Anyway, it's exactly what Moses asks God to do, to repent. And that's what God does. God turns. Now, this is uncomfortable, especially if you're a providential deist who doesn't need God to change God's mind on any particular issue because God's kind of set the thing in motion. Or you have very developed systematic theologies around how God acts in the world. But here it is in the Psalter, just like it is in the Torah, at a climactic point. Some put this as the middle point of the Psalter. I'm thinking of Wilson. And what's God going to do? And we do see that there is a shift in understanding that God is king, that God is the presence that is vindicating, not the human king that we've relied on and still rely on. And so there is a thematic shift here too. But it is intertextual at the very moment where you start to get echoes of Exodus 32, 33, and 34. There is echoes of what God puts behind God's name, Yahweh, Yahweh, gracious, abundant and steadfast love, forgiving, throughout the generations. All of that's in 34, passing by Moses there. But I want you to see how these themes not only are complex, but it's as if as the Psalter develops, as it functions as a whole narrative, but as it functions as compact units, it's like it's being expanded in a way that drives the reader forward narratively. Okay, so not just an intertextual nod back to the Exodus, but a theme that's developing throughout this section. Okay, so one of the key thinkers that I've read over and over is Joe Blenkinsop, and I think he's passed now, but he has a book on the Pentateuch. He does the Anchor Bible, Isaiah. He's got a great commentary on Ezekiel. He's very prolific. And he gets how different sections of the Hebrew Bible function together. In this book, Wisdom and Law in the Old Testament, I'm putting it in front of you partly because he does have a classic section on ethics or behavior, how people thought they should act in light of the wisdom tradition. And it pairs well with our reading. It's a great book. What it does, as far as intertextual thinking goes, is it really pays attention to layers like the Deuteronomistic layer in the Torah and how that syncs up with wisdom. And so it's not just, this verse parallels this verse, but there's big thematic or theological moves in the Old Testament that he notices impact the reading of wisdom. And so he does a great job of, in a short amount of time, putting these big pieces together in a way that makes sense if you're going to use the Psalter as a launching pad for intertextual thinking. One article I have that focuses primarily on this is Chris Hayes' article, Echoes of the Ancient Near East. And it's in his father's Thethrift. This is Richard Hayes' Fetchrift at 60 years old. Richard Hayes passed away this year. This collection, I've read a couple of these. This collection's really great. The first article by Stanley Hauerwas, why it's important to read the words the way they run or something like that, is a classic article. I cite it often. But Hayes, the second article, the article his son offers him. Hayes is an Old Testament scholar at Fuller Seminary, where my wife and I graduated. And every time I would email him about a commentary, should I go with this judge's commentary or that judge's commentary? He goes, go with Niditch. Also, she was my, mentor in undergrad. Like, oh, didn't know you went to Elmhurst. Cool. And then he'd stop in and have a great conversation. He's the translator of Isaiah in the Common English Bible, if that's interesting to you. And so as he works through his father's New Testament work and applies it to how we read the Old Testament, he takes note of Richard Hayes's rubric for identifying intertextual connections, robust intertextual connections, and will use this to develop a narrative theology of the Psalter, because part of the function, of course, it seems, is that the Psalter keeps reminding us of the story that's come before. 5 books, 5 hallelujah choruses. Notice the tree in Psalm 1. And it's well watered. It's an Edenic image. The Psalter is constantly reminding us of the former story. It's almost like that's how it functions. We will notice this in the Thanksgiving Psalms, particularly 116, where the psalmist is telling of old, telling their story, and then telling others to tell their story in light of what God has done, which is a good theology of chesed, God's faithfulness. And so there is this layered intertextual function that I think the Psalter puts on display in a profound way. So here's Hayes. He says availability, volume, reoccurrence or clustering. I'm identifying a little cluster here between 88, 89, and 90. There's a clustering of texts which develop, Hayes would say, thematic coherence. Does it make sense? We'll test our thematic coherence rubric on the Psalter as we approach 119. Is it important to the reader that the Egyptian Hallel, these praise psalms, run right up to the long, arduous acrostic that is a celebration of the law, the Torah, Egypt, Torah. Is there a thematic move here? What comes after it? Zion Psalms? Babylon? Will we as readers be able to keep up with this thematic coherence? Is it there, is one way of saying it, which is Huizinga says this in an article about comparing Jesus and Isaac, that in Matthew he's studying, Isaac is there in the text, even though he might not be mentioned explicitly. Is the theme there? When we get done reading, can we look back and go, oh yeah, I can see it. So thematic coherence, historical plausibility. Now for us, we're not paying much attention to this, partly because our text has been collected over so long. And when we do try to do historical critical or even form critical renderings of Psalms, placing them in their Sitzbenleben, their life setting, we often get 5 different options from 5 different scholars. And then if you have to ask those scholars again, they might have 3 different options for you. So it's more interesting to think about how things have been interpreted historically, the use of these texts. Maybe it is in the Haftorah, the early Jewish liturgies, perhaps in the Mishnah, and then even New Testament texts. Satisfaction, which is does the proposed intertextual reading illuminate the surrounding discourse and make some larger sense of the author's argument as a whole. That one does feel pretty, very qualitative. But the way I say this one is, does it preach? And those listening to the sermons will be the judge of that. And then Hayes, as you have the article available to you, he offers a beyond echoes. What do we do with interpretation beyond that? And quotes Kristeva, who's our theorist, who gives us this term, the book Desire and Language, and really gets down to the crux of her argument. She is interested not just in textual borrowings, but how people live as texts. One book that works with her work is called Body/Text. And so she thinks that we as desiring beings, as people in the world, are textualized. We live in a kind of story, whether we acknowledge it or not. She takes principles of narratology seriously. Mikhail Ball, who I'm thinking of. So intertextual connections will be really interesting, but I do want to prioritize the concept of narrative as a function. One of the people I keep reading is Caleb Carmichael, and he has not done a lot of work on the Psalms. He's read Deuteronomy as wisdom long time ago, Laws of Deuteronomy, old Cornell pub. He's done work in the Gospel of John. I really like his book on Leviticus, Illuminating Leviticus, a study of its laws and insights in light of biblical narratives. And his book on Numbers is great. And notice the book of Numbers, a critique of Genesis. And part of what his work does and extends is the concept of law and then expansions of the law in the narratives and then in poetry. And Asnat Barton, whose article is on our list, does a similar thing with wisdom literature, that within these small parallelisms, right, at the verse level, and thematically with whole psalms, and with texts as wholes, what you have is a kind of storied nature down to the verse level, and often they're like micro laws. Now, what Carmichael does, similar to her, is that they both see the kind of arbitrariness of law as a tell to the coherence of other stories. If you read Numbers 5, go ahead and do it. Numbers 6, more people are familiar with it because of the priestly blessing and Nazirite vows and whatnot. But 5 is that kind of eerie story about a priest priests who are instructed to put a kind of solution down the throat of a woman who's suspected to be an adulteress to see if the baby is aborted. It's often not quoted passage. It's a strange text. Now, if there's a story that goes along with it, it doesn't seem all that arbitrary of a law, and Carmichael makes a compelling case that is the case. Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, he shows every gesture connects to the Joseph story in Genesis 37 through 50, down to what the priest wears, why the priest has blood on them, etc., why there's 2 goats. You'll have to read them, but it's really compelling. He showed that out of the 613 laws in the Torah, at least 430 of them have using Hayes's rubric or something similar, have intertextual coherence with narratives. And so one of the functions of the Psalms as a reader is, are you able to, as a reader, one, see how things develop, meditate on that, but also, are you listening to Psalm 1? Are you meditating on the law? How is this Torah? Oh, you guys see this? How is this law, how is this Psalm instructive, right, as a text? Okay, we'll pause it here. We'll pick up on what we've done here in a section on theology, and then ethics, reception in let's see, tomorrow. All right, peace.